Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Before the curtain rises on our episode today, I'd be grateful if you would consider becoming a patron of the podcast. For less than the price of a couple of ice creams at the interval, you can help me to continue to make the podcast, and patrons also enjoy additional content about the plays we cover. My heartfelt thanks go to our newest patron, Becky Nichols. Thank you, Becky, for your support. For more information about becoming a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast. Thank you. And now, on with today's episode. Hello, and welcome to episode 56 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. As the curtain rises, a 1930s dance band is playing. A university professor, John Halder, tells us that he has always turned to music at the dramatic moments of his life as a strategy for survival, as he calls it. As the band plays, it becomes clear that in fact only Halder hears the music. It is playing inside his own head. The music will be a constant for him, because he is indeed living in dramatic times. This is Germany in the 1930s, and the professor finds himself drawn into joining the Nazi elite as they pursue their terrible political and cultural agenda. His story is played out in CP Taylor's play Good, which charts how an ostensibly good person can become not just complicit to evil behavior, but an active participant. As we record this episode, a new production of Good is currently running at the Harold Pinter Theatre in London's West End, directed by Dominic Cooke and starring David Tennant as John Halder. Good was first staged by the Royal Shakespeare Company at the Donmar Warehouse in September 1981, with Alan Howard winning both the Evening Standard Award and the Plays and Players Best Actor Awards. I was fortunate enough to have seen that production, and vivid images from it have stayed with me ever since. So I was very excited to have another chance to revisit this play. I'm doubly excited and honored to have the opportunity to talk with director Dominic Cooke today about the play and his new production. There are countless reasons why it is an honor to welcome Dominic to the podcast, namely his amazing list of credits as a director. He was the artistic director of the Royal Court Theatre from 2006 to 2013, where he presided over an exhilaratingly creative period, which included premieres of Jez Butterworth's Jerusalem, Lucy Preble's Enron, and Bruce Norris's Clybourne Park, to name just a few of my favorites. He's an associate director of the National Theatre, where his acclaimed productions have included Carol Churchill's Here We Go, August Wilson's Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, and Stephen Sondheim's Follies in 2017, which was nominated for no fewer than 10 Olivier Awards. And more recently, he directed Larry Kramer's The Normal Heart and Emlyn Williams' The Corn is Green at the National. If that's not enough, Dominic is also a writer and director for TV and film, having adapted and directed the BBC series of Shakespeare's The Hollow Crown, The Wars of the Roses, as well as directed the films On Chesil Beach and The Courier, and he's next due to direct a film version of Follies. I make no apology for reeling off his credits, and this is only an edited list because his theater CV reads like the very best of the Play Podcast catalog. Welcome, Dominic. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Douglas. It's great to be here.
So I read that you saw Good in its original production and that it made a strong impression on you as it did me. What was that impression, and why were you attracted to come back and direct the play now?
You know what? I was quite young when I saw it. I mean, I think actually one of the things that I remember most vividly about it was the style of it, the style of the production, which at that time for me was very unusual. You know, it was a sort of stripped back Brechtian production with a large cast, amazing central performance. And I just remember being very involved and drawn into it. I don't think my ability in my teens to read theatre was much more sophisticated than that. But then I came back to the play a couple of times, I reread it and realised what a sort of original and powerful way into the subject of genocide the play offered. And then about how long ago, I don't know, more than that, 7 years ago, I think I thought, I'd really like to do this, but I think there's a way of doing it that's a sort of fresh take on the play. because it was written for the RSC, which, which had huge resources. At the time that the play was done, the form of the play, which is sort of very impressionistic, it's a memory play, and so it jumps back and forwards in time, so a very sort of fragmented structure, was quite unusual. People were beginning to experiment in sort of mainstream theatre with that, but it was relatively new, whereas now that in itself has become almost a cliche. And I thought, well, how do you create the same sort of dislocation in the audience, the sort of same effect that play had at the time it was done for an audience now? So I came up with this idea of doing it with only 3 actors, and the sort of experience that the character is going through of not quite knowing where he is, what's happening, and who is in front of him, the sort of blur of reality that he goes through could be reflected in the production. So that's sort of, I've sort of gone beyond the question that you asked, but that's why I went from watching the play and becoming interested in doing it.
Well, we'll very much talk about the form and some of your choices in staging that. Before we dive into that, I wonder if you could tell us a bit about who CP Taylor was, because I hazard to suggest that many listeners may not know about him, and where also did good come from in his life and career. Do you know that?
I know a bit. I mean, he was a very prolific writer. He was a Glaswegian writer who was born in the 30s from a Jewish background, working class. And he lived for a lot of his life in Newcastle, where he had a very strong relationship with one of the big undersung theatres in Britain, which is Live Theatre in Newcastle, which has actually sort of yielded an extraordinary list of playwrights, including Lee Hall and, quite a few really fantastic writers. And it's a sort of unusual thing because it's a new writing theatre outside London. It's an interesting place because it's sort of a real sort of left-wing theatre that's sort of rooted in, I would say, a sort of intelligent populism, and actually the auditorium, I don't know what it's like now, but it used to be like a sort of cabaret in that, you sat around tables with your pint. You didn't really sit in rows. So it was really conceived as a sort of working class theatre. And so he was very much, out of that post-war left-wing Brechtian theatre movement. And he'd written a hell of a lot of plays there. I mean, I maybe 30 plays. I don't know exactly, but something like.
I read somewhere that he wrote more than 80 plays in his life, and he only lived to be 52, which is extraordinary. So
yeah, he was very prolific. Yeah, but I think he had a sort of artistic home there, and the plays use music a lot. Interestingly, he was very interested in music. He clearly had a feel for music because all the music choices in the play are the original ones that he used in the first production, and you can tell it's a very sort of sensitive ear that he had. So he was writing those plays, and then I don't know the story of the commission, but this was commissioned by the RSC, as I understand it. And so he was writing for a bigger palette, and he really found a form that worked, not just for the subject and the sort of very interesting way he goes into the subject of the Holocaust and how good people do bad things, but actually also he seems very comfortable on a larger canvas. So yeah, the play was commissioned. They were doing a lot of new writing at the RSC at that time. Howard Davies was in charge of all of that. And so yes, they did the play, and then he died just after. He was about to go to Broadway. They'd done it twice in London, and he was about to go to Broadway, and he died. And as you say, he was in his early 50s. So it's a real tragedy, actually, because God knows where he'd have gone from here. He seemed to respond hugely to being able to sort of increase resources.
Yeah, and that's a shame, as you say, because Good was probably his best known play, actually, as it turns out. And he had this break, I suppose, to do it with the RSC. And it's interesting you mentioned he was Jewish, of course. He talked in a note to the published text of the play, and I'm going to quote him here. He grew up during the war under a deeply felt anxiety that the Germans might win the war, overrun Britain, and that I and my mother and father would end up, like my less fortunate co-religionists, in a Nazi death camp, perhaps specially built in Scotland or England. That's an absolutely chilling thought, isn't it? That brings home how close that was to being possible. And then he also said in this preface that there had been some pressure building up in me for a long time to write a play about the final solution, marking and responding to a great historical and personal trauma. Not as a Jew wanting to add my wreath to those already piled high at the graves of the 6 million, but as my own little gesture to revive their memory in our consciousness. That seems an important phrase about raising consciousness, which we'll talk a lot more about, I think. But before we jump into that, Dominic, I wonder, for listeners who are not familiar with the play, if we could give them a very brief summary of what happens without giving everything away, but enough that they can follow along and understand what actually happens a bit.
Yeah, so it's set in Frankfurt. It starts 1933 and it sort of goes through to probably about 10 years later. The dates aren't that specific. The only thing we know is there are historical events that occur that are very present in the play. And the first one is Hitler coming to power in 1933. And he is a lecturer in literature, German literature, in the university in Frankfurt. So he's sort of a member of the intelligentsia, and he has an awful lot of domestic responsibilities. So the first part of the play is his life before he becomes involved in National Socialism. And he spends most of his time sort of looking after people. He has a lot of dependents around him. So he's living a life which is not completely fulfilled because so much of the time is spent taking care of other people. And then the story really goes through those 10 years and how he gradually becomes more and more involved in the Nazi party and their activity. I mean, in fact, becomes very active, as you said. He becomes a participant in it. The play gets into, the question of how people respond under pressure in a world where they are surrounded by a particular set of values, in this case, really dangerous, destructive values. I mean, my guess is that the play is influenced by the Diaries of Victor Klemperer, which is a book that I'm sort of slightly obsessed by. I've always been, I mean, I have a Jewish background as well, but I don't think that's the thing that led me to this. I think it's more to do with the time of my birth. I was born 20 years after the war. The war was so present in my life because my parents were defined by it. And even the environment, growing up in the UK, there were still bomb sites everywhere in the 60s and 70s. It was so present. It took so long for Britain to recover. And I think I've always been fascinated in a sort of very dark way with how such a terrible thing could have happened. I mean, I think there are other things in history which are equally awful, like the transatlantic slave trade, or I think the thing that for me makes the Holocaust particularly hard to understand is the sort of industrial scale of it and the seeming purposelessness of it. I mean, I know that sounds ridiculous. You say that about the slave trade. Well, if you take out morality and humanity, slave trade was simply a business transaction where people made money. The killing of the Jews, who actually gained anything from that? I mean, I know that there's the common enemy idea, but the scale, all of those things, and the fact that, which the play addresses, the key question is, how did so many people get involved in it? How did so many people follow this clear lunatic and suspend any sense of their own humanity? And I think the play tries to find and explore that, which is the big and difficult question. That's what I really like about the play and about Taylor's approach, is he doesn't allow himself the easy, because you can make plays about terrible things that happen in history that are very moving and powerful quite easily, because the material is that way, is sort of tilted that way. But he doesn't do that. He sort of takes the hardest possible question, which history really continually need to ask, which is how do ordinary people, how do people who are basically decent, not the psychopaths, and there were psychopaths and Nazis, Goebbels. I mean, look at the people at the top. There were people who were psychopaths. Look at the people in the camps. A lot of people who were running the camps were in that, 5% of human beings that are that way inclined, 1%, I don't know, who are psychopaths, who have no capacity whatsoever for empathy. But that doesn't answer. The fact those people got into positions of power in this regime does not answer how it happened. So that's the core of the play, and it puts the audience, I think, in quite a troubling and difficult position.
Yeah, so it would talk about these themes that you've raised, really important things at the core of the play. And in fact, one of the interesting points you raised just there about the impracticality of it, they actually talk about it, don't they, at the beginning of the play, Halder, and his best friend is Maurice. Maurice is Jewish, a psychiatrist, and he can see that there's trouble brewing, the anti-Semitism that's made very public. But when it comes to it, they both think, well, this would be completely perverse because the Jews contribute so much to society. The same argument is made I also recently saw a production of Incident at Vichy, Arthur Miller, and the same argument is made. They basically go, it's madness. Why would they do this? It's totally impractical to eliminate a labor force, for example, let alone everything else the Jews were capable of contributing. in business, etc. So they don't really believe any reasonable or rational person or government would make those choices. And of course, no rational government would make those choices. I was interested you mentioned the Diaries of Victor Klemperer. Just tell us a little bit about what's in that. What is that model?
Well, it really is. I've read a fair amount, like anyone interested in history has read a fair amount about the Holocaust or about the rise of the Nazis and people's first-person testimonies. There's been so much art made about it, either directly or indirectly. But what is unique about Klemperer is that he lived through it. So it's not been altered after the fact. It's a diary there are several, but the key one is the first one, which is from 33 to 42. In Dresden, he was Jewish, and very similar, he was a lecturer actually in French literature, and his wife was not Jewish, and that's how he survived. And it documents their day-to-day life. So, and actually, Elliot Levy, who's in the play, one of the first things we did by chance was go, have you read Victor Klemperer? Almost at the same time. And, we both felt very strongly that he had, because the experience in this, Klemperer is not like Halder. He's not a perpetrator. He's a victim of this awful thing. But what's so powerful about it is that it's as much about his domestic life, the pressures on his domestic life, losing his job, losing money, losing his home, this gradual disintegration of his life, and how he manages that. And of course, the focus is not at the long term, and it's not predicting that there's going to be death camps, because that wasn't in anyone's head when you were in 1933. It's like, oh no, what am I going to do? And what is so extraordinary is, as you go through, the years, how people's propensity to normalize situations, how common that is. And that's also a theme of the play. So, at the beginning, it's, oh, well, Hitler will be out in 6 months. He's a joke. He's a joke. No one's going to. How's he going to stay in power, that loony? And it goes on, Oh, well, we're in the war, but, the Americans are going to come in any day now. This is going to be over. And then you get to 1942 and it's, the Goldbergs down the street have disappeared. And of course, when you're reading it with the benefit of hindsight and you're seeing what's happening, and you're seeing how it's not that he's unaware of the horrors of the anti-Semitic regime, but, he's just so busy trying to sort of get on with his life, and he doesn't imagine the unimaginable. We're not capable of imagining the unimaginable. And it becomes very hard, I think, when you're in a situation like that, to really sort of differentiate and work out precisely what's happening. And even Morris in Good, whilst he sort of initially is like, there was a sort of existential fear of what's happening, he rationalizes it. He's a therapist, and he rationalizes it. And he says, well, of course, that's not going to happen. Because the thing that's interesting about Germany and the Jews is that, unlike, say, Poland or somewhere, in the Russian-dominated areas, the Jews in Germany were very, very integrated. They were part of the society. A lot of them had very senior roles. And in fact, in Frankfurt, where he chose to set the play, the mayor was Jewish. And so it was harder for the Germans to see, the German Jews and the Austrian Jews, because it was similar there, to imagine the possibility. A lot of these people had been officers in the First World War. They had medals. They were part of German society, and they saw themselves as Germans. And in fact, that's very clear in the play. So it was almost as hard for the Jews there to see what was going to happen as it was for anyone to see it.
Yeah, and you're right. It's about everyday survival, and it is incremental, isn't it? And of course, you can't conceive where it's headed. And it's interesting you say it's a joke. There's parallels all over the place. I was going to come to ask you about the relevance to today, but you think about leaders who we think are a joke, right, and could never be elected and became the leaders. It's interesting because, again, the incident at Vichy, there's a line that I recalled from there, and he talks about the collective denial, because the rumors of the final solution are so inconceivably vile. That is their power. To do the inconceivable, it paralyzes the rest of us, which, of course, it seems to do. And as you say, we'll talk a bit about how this incremental thing works, because that is the key to the whole play, really, is the arc of how Halder goes through the process from where he starts to where he finishes. I wanted to go back, before we do that, to the structure of the play, because you started off talking about that. And I also noticed in the published text, the preface, that Taylor referred to this as a tragedy, which I've written as a comedy or musical comedy. And you have to say, it seems unlikely to call a play about the Third Reich a musical comedy. I referred in the introduction to the dance band playing, and throughout the text, anyway, there are stage directions that indicate that various musical characters pop up. A dance band, a tenor singing Wagner, a street musician dressed as Hitler even, playing a Yiddish folk song, It all gets a bit surreal at times, it would appear. Although in your production, you choose not to materialize these actual musicians because, of course, they're actually playing inside Halder's head. So I was going to ask you, why did you choose not to do that? And more generally, what do you think the purpose of the music is? You mentioned music in his plays before and how sensitively he's using that. But why is he using the music?
The music in the play is very much a metaphor for the sort of mental blurring and smudging that goes on when one is confronted with horrible realities. So he sort of conjures up music for difficult moments in his life. And every time there's a difficult decision to make, it sort of gets anesthetized by the music in his head. And that's the idea. So that's one of the reasons why we didn't want it. The last line of the play is the band was real, because he imagines bands. And it's a very eclectic range of music that he hears, from pop music of the time to great German classics. But it seemed important that the music was not real. So that's why we didn't have a band.
So it is literally representing what's going on inside his head, because it isn't real.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's a sort of form of escape, isn't it? He calls it at the beginning, as I mentioned, a strategy for survival, turning reality into fantasy.
Yeah.
And he says, I can't lose myself in people or situations. Everything's acted out against this bloody musical background. So it distances him from the world. But also what's interesting to me was, again, there's a connection to Incident of Vichy, because there's some sense that this is a cultured man, isn't there, Dominic? And that his knowledge of music, you say, is wide-ranging. So is there some suggestion that raises the question that, how can cultured people even be drawn to the vulgarity of fascism, as Arthur Miller called it? And in fact, they can.
Yeah, they can, and they did. This is the tragedy of it. And actually, I think he's sort of targeting the kind of people that might go to an RSC show. I think it's sort of part of the way he conceptualized the play was to think, well, who's the kind of person that an RSC audience in 1981 might either be or aspire to be. So he's a very learned man. He really knows his stuff. He's an intellectual. And he's very much in the world of the mind. His wife is a musician. They're sort of bohemians, really. And again, I admire him for that, because that's a much harder thing to dramatize. It's not easy to convince an audience of that someone like that, as you say, the sort of coarseness and vulgarity and brutality of the regime, but they did. So one of the ways he does this is through music. There is an awful lot of sort of rationalization as well that you're exposed to, the sort of way that he can use his intellect to justify. I mean, it actually propels him into National Socialism, because he uses his intellect to sort of dehumanize the situation, to take out sort of messy feelings about human vulnerability and empathy. And instead, he takes a sort of austere, rational response, and he employs his understanding of modern Western philosophy and puts that into it. So it's actually, there's a bit of a dig at intellectuals in the play.
I love the idea that, as you said, that Taylor's targeting his very audience, that he's almost making them complicit, saying this could be you, of course, which is part of the point. But also that it's interesting you're saying about them being able to intellectualize this, but he does it in a perverse way. He actually twists things, so he gets things completely backwards at times. And of course, he comes up with all these specious arguments as the play goes on. He becomes more and more deeply involved. We started off with the racial programs impractical. They need the economic contribution of the Jews. He then thinks he could influence things for the better if he joins the party. We've all fallen for that one, possibly. He thinks euthanasia is justifiable. Somehow he comes up to being able to argue that. And that finally, of course, that the Jews should have left when they could. It's their fault because they didn't leave. And finally, that there's no such thing as objective moral truth, which he ties himself in complete knots trying to argue that there is no right or wrong. If that's his belief, then that's a vacuum into which evil is easily enters and justified. But I wanted to come back again to the form, because this is not naturalistic, is it, Dominic? I mean, what we talked about is this is slightly crazy that this music's playing inside this guy's head and interrupting the play, but also that the chronology, it jumps back and forth, scenes merge into one another. So Halder participates simultaneously in scenes with different people and locations overlapping on the stage. Why does he construct the play that way?
I think there's an argument in the play which actually is slightly ahead of its time, because these ideas are very contemporary now and sort of more widely accepted, of the ability, or rather the relationship of memory to trauma, and how hard it is to recover painful memories, and memories in this instance which are about guilt. And one of the decisions that we made with the play was to say, well, he's talking to us from the end of all of this, right?
So this is a question I was got to ask you straight away, because your interpretation is this is a memory, that this is in the past.
Yeah, it has to be, really, because even in the first 20 minutes of the play, he's jumped forward to 1942, at least. I think, of course, even a month on from opening the play, I can't remember exactly, but the first few scenes jump from 1933 to 1942. So he has to be beyond that. And then even when he's in at the very end, I won't say where he is, but he's in the middle of the Holocaust, he's saying the band was real, right? So he's beyond that. So we sort of made a decision that we would place his present, if you like, because he talks to the audience and tells his story to the audience. That present is at the end of the war, or after. It has to be after he's been involved in the Holocaust. So therefore he's remembering things. And as he remembers, if you look at some of the key decisions he makes to get involved, for example, in the euthanasia program with disabled people, where the Nazis sort of prototyped the final solution, they prototyped the Holocaust, sort of industrial model of killing. And what's interesting is that the first meeting where he's inducted into that is broken into 3 sections, and it's almost like he can't remember, he doesn't want to go, he sort of starts remembering it, and then it's too painful and he pushes it away and goes into a slightly easier memory, which would be, say, him and his Jewish friend. And that's the bit of himself he wants to connect with. And it's a gradual process. And I think there's something quite truthful about that, about the way that we choose to remember, and the tricks that the unconscious plays on us in terms of being able to face things. But there does feel like at the beginning of the play that there's a conscious desire to piece together how he became the person that he became. Well, that's the decision we made, and we felt that was pretty justified by the text of the play.
Yeah, I get that. And even if it were current, as you say, it's how does that happen? Because it jumps back and forth quite a long way in time. It's a picture of a mind in action, isn't it? Really, the fluid form.
It is. It absolutely is. Yeah. It's very in the presence of the play that he's recovering and deciding to go this way or that way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And our mind in action is not a linear narrative at any stage of our lives, probably, but certainly not in memory and how we choose what we remember. And you mentioned that he talks out loud to himself and directly to us, the audience. So what is the purpose and effect of him doing that? Why does Taylor have him talk to the audience?
I sort of feel like the idea is to bring us into this man's justification, because I think that the hardest thing for someone to do with an audience when they're talking about the Holocaust is make the audience identify with someone who participated in the Holocaust. That is a really hard thing to do for good reason. But it's a great thing to do as a dramatist, because if you can make people understand how that could happen and how someone can think themselves into that and how someone could justify doing it, perhaps you're more likely to stop it from happening again. And that, rather than telling us what we already know, mind you, it's such an awful fact that actually being told what you already know is not a problem for me. I think it's important to be reminded of these things in history. But this way in, forcing the audience to identify with this person who becomes a participant, I think has a very political purpose. And a sort of moral purpose, actually, as well.
Yeah, I think there is some sense, isn't it, of complicity. There's some way that he is seeking to justify himself or our approval, or saying it's reasonable, isn't it, that I did this? Isn't it sort of an unspoken question like that running through it all? He's almost explaining to us and himself that this was a reasonable choice, which makes us a bit more complicit as well. But also, of course, it allows us very cleverly, as you've just said, to see the flaws in his thinking. And it also reveals, I think, his duplicity as well at times, where particularly when he's reenacting scenes with Maurice, his best friend, and his wife, So in Maurice, he'll be talking to him as if it's a present scene and in friendly terms, but he'll turn to us and say something that's undermining what his relationship with Maurice is or what he thinks of Maurice. And similar to his wife, which I think doesn't do him any favors, that we see that duplicity, does it?
But it's sort of weirdly permissive as well. It doesn't make us admire him, but it might help us to identify with him in a strange way because he's also honest with us and he owns his own darkness in places, not all the time, but in places. He does say, there's certain points where he sort of says things like, well, I wish I was a better person.
Yeah.
Words to the effect of that. And there's one really great bit in the play, which is horrifying and very powerful, I think, in the writing, where he says, I do care about the Jews, I do, but they're quite low down my list because I've got other things that I need to think about. And I've got to pay my bills. I've got all these people I need to look after me. And the Jews really, honestly, are quite low down. And I think there's something about that. It's not obviously not likable or admirable, but there's something in the honesty of it that I think allows the audience to feel identification or interest in this character. So it's a double-edged thing. Yes, there's sort of a repulse, but they're also drawn to him, I think. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to cast someone like David Tennant, because David is immensely likable presence and very charming and witty and all the things that person needs to do. And, one of the key things I was thinking about who should do this part was who's the last person you would ever imagine becoming a Nazi.
You're absolutely right that's one of the fundamental points of the play is it's set against type, right? This is not a type who you're supposed to think would go this direction. And Alan Howard, as I remember, a mild-mannered character.
Yeah.
He is perfect as a university professor. He can't possibly have this kind of viciousness or aggression in him. I was going to ask you, do we like him? Is part of this point about him speaking to us? Do we empathize with him? How does the play goes on? Do we feel about him?
I think we should identify with him in places. My job really was to make the audience identify with him as much as humanly possible. Because I think, it's interesting, since I've been doing movies, there's a lot more money involved. There's often a lot of concern about likability of characters. And my argument is always, likability isn't the thing. Being able to understand someone and identify with them, at least in terms of why they make their decisions, is the thing. We know this because we can watch a play like Richard III and be very entertained, even though we think we know what he's doing is disgusting. So I feel like it's a mistake to feel you have to like the character. And I think that, in a way, liking is dangerous because then you stop the character from doing more human things that you can if you're not careful. So that's the thing with this character is, of course, the more it goes on, and the more objectively you can see what he's doing, the bigger the challenge is for the actor and for the production to make sure the audience don't completely give up on him. The dramaturgy of the play helps because it brings you into his personal life a lot and his relationships, compromises, and because he has a second relationship which evolves in the play, and there's a love conflict, a love triangle in the play. And I think that's partly there because, there's a lot more to that actually than just this, but part of it is the personal dilemma and complexity of that and the pain of all of that gives a sort of parallel life and a sort of focus on moral weakness and things that are slightly more identifiable than getting involved in genocide for a regular audience.
I think that's crucial to the structure of the play and how cleverly Taylor has orchestrated this, is that the morality of his personal behavior parallels what is happening in his public and political life, so to speak. And we see that step by step, that he ends up with compromises in his personal life, which essentially betray the moral weakness, which is responsible for his decisions in this other sphere in terms of his political allegiance or his behavior, at least. It's absolutely spot on, you're saying, about understanding rather than liking, because, again, very cleverly, he gives us a number of potential reasons for why does Halder do what he does at various stages. So he's looking after his mother, who has a dementia and is calling on him all the time. And anyone who's been a carer or has understood these kind of demands, it can be pretty frustrating. And so at some point, his sympathy for her starts to wane, and he becomes frustrated by that. His wife is not very capable in domestic terms, say. She doesn't look after the house. She doesn't cook meals. She has her own mental issues, I think. And this is a burden to him as well. So he finds an outlet for that. Is this the life I choose? Not really. And so there's a number of these things that go on where you can see that there are frustrations, and he chooses things which we might naturally choose as well.
I think you're absolutely right. You know, the sort of ability to make selfish choices, if you like. I mean, you might say they're not selfish, and maybe it's right that he leaves his wife. I mean, you can't live your life constantly putting yourself on hold and doing everything for everyone else. Although I sort of think he does love her, and they do sort of love each other. But he creates some pretty morally blurry bits in his personal life.
Pretty odious behavior at various times where he can't bring himself to leave her, or he is leaving her and telling her he isn't leaving her when he actually is. It's
cowardly.
Yeah, exactly. But there are some other things, again, coming back, Dominic, to the incremental nature of it that we can understand and maybe appreciate how this gradually happens, the reasons that he makes some of the decisions. So, for example, some of it is about personal advantage. I mean, firstly, you talked earlier about survival. One of the things is that his career at the university is dependent on whether he joins the Nazi party or not. His father says, your career is over if you don't join the Nazi party.
That's true.
Well, what would we do? What would we all do if that were the pressure decision we'd have to make? So he joins the party in order to preserve that. And then, but what about these other personal advantages, for example, when he's asked to join the SS? That's out of vanity, isn't it?
He's flattered by it. And flattery is a very important thing in the play. In fact, most of the Nazis who try and get him on board, they flatter him. And he's very vulnerable to that. But human beings are vulnerable to that. It's amazing how much more vulnerable to flattery people are than we would like to think. Including myself. I think we're all vulnerable to that. And one has to be careful, very careful.
If you're invited to join the top team, the exclusive club, I mean, who resists that?
It's dangerous.
It is.
So money, I mean, you talk about personal advancement, that's absolutely very accurate, but there's also, as the play goes on, he becomes a lot richer and a lot more comfortably off, and he's not worrying about money anymore. And that is also true. I mean, there's another story about the Nazis, which I think is really worth sharing. There's been a couple of things about this, but I think it's so important that it was a cartel. You know, one of the useful things about them targeting the Jews was that there was a lot of wealth within the Jewish community, especially not so much in the eastern areas of Europe, but in Germany and in
Vienna.
And of course, they stole everything. I mean, art has been talked about a fair amount, but they just stole all the wealth of the Jews, and they requisitioned it, and it's still hanging around. This is the awful thing. This is an area that really should be talked about and looked at more. How that wealth is still in the wrong hands. And it was just stolen. And I mean, it's there in Arturo. There's a sort of gangster element to the Nazis where they just stole a bunch of stuff. And then they made up a whole load of lies about the people whose wealth they stole so that they could have it. There is more to it than that. But there is an element of it that's like that. And, you know, Halder does very well professionally and materially through his involvement with the Nazis. And then there's, I think, one of the best scenes in the play is that on Kristallnacht, he's required to do the dirty work, at least to lead a bunch of people. And Kristallnacht was one of the key turning point moments. It really was the beginning of the Holocaust. It started a few years earlier, but it was the moment at which the lid was taken off in terms of violence towards Jewish people openly happening.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's asked to do this. And there's this young working class guy who turns up and basically says, oh, you're doing rather well for yourself, aren't you? Look at this lovely big house you've got. And the subtext of that scene is, well, you better step up because you don't get this for nothing. It's very Faustian because he teaches Goethe, and Goethe lived in Frankfurt. And there's a whole sort of Faust subtext to the play.
He's done the deal with the devil.
He's done the deal with the devil, right? He's made moral choices, and now he has to pay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's such a brilliant scene. That scene, it's so well written, you know, because it's all under the lines, but it's absolutely clear that you don't get this fantastic life you've got for nothing.
So yes, it's status and wealth and all those things are pretty hard to resist.
Yeah.
I'm sort of going back and forth here a little bit. I wanted to go back to the beginning because you started off by talking about the big cast, and I counted 15 characters, I think, in all who appear in the play, not including the musicians or singers who are in his head.
Mm-hmm.
And you stage your production with only 4 actors, in fact, I think, but 3 primarily, because one does not appear till near the end. And David Tennant only plays Halder. So there's doubling up all over the place. Why did you choose to do it that way?
Well, I suppose there were 2 things. The main thing was I wanted the audience to have the same sort of blurry experience that Halder has about reality. Because I think, as you said at the very beginning of the conversation, you said, the very beginning of the play, it's very clear that we are in Halder's head. We are not in an objective reality. So everything is received as it is received by Halder. And it's like, well, how can we enhance the audience's experience of that? I think the sort of fractured storytelling is now so familiar to audiences that I don't think it would have the same effect as it would have had in 1981. And I wanted to do the same thing that he was trying to do in those days. So actually, the next thing I did was I went to speak to his agent. I just said to him, this is my idea. If I was to do it, this is how I would want to do it, because I want the audience to be in Halder's experience of reality, which is confusing and blurry. So that's the idea. So the basic thought was, you take the two people that he's betrayed most, his wife and his friend Morris, and you cast those people. And then those people sort of morph into other characters. And it becomes, as the production goes on, they're sort of playing people that are further removed from them. So they're playing different genders, they're playing completely against who they are. And that was the idea, that you enhance the sense of blur, if you like. But the other thing was, I really wanted to avoid the stage being populated with people in Nazi uniform from the word go, because I think the danger is we look at someone in a Nazi uniform and we just go, you're a psycho, or certainly you're an evil person. And we can't see beyond the uniform. So I wanted to find a way of doing a play where, although there are people who literally would have been in Nazi uniforms, that we could find a language where we weren't doing that. So you just saw people, because he makes a very deliberate decision in the way he wrote the play that the central character doesn't wear a Nazi uniform until quite late in the play. So I wanted to take that cue, because I think then you could see the transactions more clearly. I think if you had someone in an SS uniform telling him to go and murder disabled people, it would be a much harder scene to bring the audience into, and it would be much harder for us to understand how Halder does it, because we'd be seeing this monster in a uniform. So if you take that out and then you're looking at two people in a space, and that became the whole way we did the production. There's no props, well, very few. There's a couple later on, but we wanted to make it much more about what's happening between these people now, and let's not get too hung up on the dressing, if you like, around that.
I think it's spot on, because basically the point of the play is that it's personal and ordinary, what's going on, and not to be overwhelmed by the spectacle or the associations that we have with it as well. And I also think you mentioned about not having props and there's no set, because as we talked about, this fluid form of memory where he's moving between time and people and locations, it's essentially impractical, impossible to have a set that fits all of that. You don't need it. It's going on inside his head anyway, of course, as we said. And I have to say, Dominic, one of the things I loved about the production was the sound of some of the props that you used. So we get the sound of coffee cups. So that's happening in the soundscape, but you don't have to go through the whole process of having actual tea set or whatever it is out there on the stage. Brilliant. It actually emphasizes the sort of dreamlike memory feeling of it. But also back to the doubling up, I think there is a point, isn't there, that because Maurice, Elliot Levy, plays both Maurice and several of the Nazi officers. So he's playing both victims and oppressors. And I've often thought that in principle, doubling basically is also suggesting that people can be interchangeable. Their positions in the world are interchangeable. And it's a bit of a lottery based on, for example, where we were born, what race, what economic level of society, what parents we had. You would end up being the officer or you'd end up being the victim. And that's what happens, of course, very clearly. So the substitutions mean that any human being can act in this way and do what these characters do or be in those positions.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I think sometimes what happens is that doubling happens obviously for economic reasons, and that really was not the obviously it's helped get it on in the West End, but that's something we could have pulled off a production with 15 people with David Tennant in it. We could have done that. That's not really the issue. A play that had a huge impression on me when I was at university was Cloud 9 by Carol Churchill, where she used doubling in such a brilliant, suggestive and powerful way. It's so intentional. And I think that can be really useful. It's quite hard to do, though, I have to say, because for the actors, it's really hard. You've got to find truth. It's not like types. With this, the character still had to have a lot of complexity. So how do you make it clear and archetypal, but at the same time allowing for nuance? It was tricky. I think what's been interesting watching the actors evolve through the run is how much deeper they're going into the characters.
Well, firstly, they're tremendous. It's technically and psychologically really challenging, both for them and an audience actually to follow. I wanted to come back to talking about the uniform, because one of the most vivid moments in the play, and this is actually one of the moments I remember from the original production, is that night of Kristallnacht, you say, when Halder actually puts on the SS uniform for the first time before he goes out on the street. I'm sorry, I'm giving something away here, but I wanted to ask you, what is it about that scene? Now, you've held back to that point, and then he slowly dresses himself in the SS uniform with the help of his girlfriend, Anne. What is it about that scene that has such power? Because it's just jaw-dropping.
I think it's because you've really seen him as a human being, and very complex human being, and you've spent the best part of 2 hours in his company. And I think that's a masterstroke in the play, because he understands that once you've done that and then you see him wearing an SS uniform, it's incredibly troubling. Because in order to deal with the horror of what the Nazis did, we put them in a file of nothing to do with us. And I think, of course, it's natural, I understand that, but it's very unhelpful, because by doing that, we prevent ourselves from really learning the lessons of history and really going, okay, well, because I think people like to think that they do far more in that situation than they actually would. It's not that there weren't people who stood up, it's not that there weren't people who put their lives on the line, but they're far fewer than we would like to think. And if you look at something like the Victor Klemperer diaries, you understand why. You understand how, firstly, the insidious nature of the regime, the repetition of lies. We've seen that in recent history. If you tell people a lie enough times, it becomes the truth for them.
Yeah.
And common sense goes out window. And the Nazis, the anti-Semitism, is very deep-rooted in that part of the world. There are lots of reasons why. National identity in Germany was very fragile. They'd had a terrible time at the end of the First World War with, the reparations. All of that stuff is part of the backstory. But in the end, the constant propaganda and lies that were being told about the Jews to the German people over a very, very long period of time by very insidious people. The sort of propaganda machine of the Nazis was actually horribly sophisticated, and the links made between the Jews and the forces of capitalism got them into debt, and at the same time communism, which is sort of weird because the Jews were blamed for both. But
whatever the ill, blame them.
It's sort of extraordinary, but all of that, and I think that for me right now is because of the world of the internet and the lies that people are being exposed to, and the distortions of reality that people are being exposed to day in, day out. It is a very dangerous climate, and sometimes the parallels with the Nazis are overused in history. But I do think, even if you go from the obvious, ludicrous, nonsensical persona of Donald Trump, putting himself forward for being the president, to January the 6th, which was a sort of mini Kristallnacht. It wasn't targeting Jews, it wasn't targeting vulnerable people, but the level of violence that one saw at that moment, there is something that smells very similar to me. And I think, you look at those people who are doing what they did on January the 6th, they were all sort of QAnon people, weren't they? They were largely people who believed in conspiracy theories, and they've been exposed to those lies, cult of lies, for a long, long time. And that is a really important part of how the Nazi regime worked, and a really important lesson of history, I think. We have to be very careful.
Yes, I'm going to come to talk a little bit about those relevances, I think, with our current times in just a minute. Firstly, that's back on the uniform of that scene. I just wanted to pick up, because I think what you're saying is that and about the uniforms originally, when you're saying about not having them all on stage, the thing is, the uniform is so iconic, isn't it? It's an instant symbol of abuse of evil, in a sense. And like you, I grew up post-war, but all the images of Germany, it was just basically war movies. It was pretty black and white, and it's very hard to think past those images. But a couple other things I thought about that scene. One is that it somehow crystallizes the moral decline. It's a stunning visual symbol that he's got to this point, that he's putting on this uniform. And the other thing is about how ordinary it was. It's beautifully done in the sense, because Anne, his girlfriend, is helping him put this uniform on. We see him in his underwear. This is an ordinary human being putting on any kind of uniform to go to work. But this is not an ordinary uniform, clearly, but the way one dresses is ordinary. And she says, "You look lovely in that uniform," expressing, again, the instinct that there's some power in it as well. It's a wondrous scene. Okay, let's talk about the relevance to now, because It's clear the play has some kind of cautionary intent, as he said at the beginning, but it's very interesting to hear your views about how it's relevant to today and what those things are that it's saying. He said there are lessons to be learned if we examine the atrocities of the Third Reich as the result of the infinite complexity of contemporary human society and not a simple conspiracy of criminals and psychopaths. So it's not just, as you said earlier, this few people at the top. It takes all of us somehow to be led into a collective action. We have to collaborate or agree or somehow ascribe to whatever's being proposed. So what are the lessons we should learn from Good that are relevant now?
The sad thing is the play, because we were originally going to do it in 2020, and then of course COVID happened, and it sort of feels horribly more relevant. I mean, there are two very simple halves to that. The first half is lies and the danger of us being exposed to lies. As I've just talked about, I feel that the internet, while it's opened a lot of doors, it's allowed the spread of half-truths and downright lies presented as truths, whether it's about vaccination, whether it's about Donald Trump and his myriad of criminal activity, or some of the theories of the QAnon people. How does anyone believe that? It's so mad. And yet there are lots of people. Now, obviously, some of that is rooted in their own feelings of disempowerment. There are genuine problems underneath this, just as there were in Nazi Germany. There are causes underneath it. But in that void, unfortunately, the internet has opened up this awful mass of complete distortions. And that is dangerous. So for me, that's half of it. The other half is about the opposite, which is about awful truths. And the awful truth of this play is that you've got a murderous regime in power that is destroying millions of people. And it's very hard when you're in the middle of an awful truth on that scale to really see it for what it is, and to really not just recognize it, but to act, to take action, morally correct action. And that's also everywhere. I mean, the environment is the obvious example for me, because I sort of feel like we do know that all the facts point us towards the fact that we are in the middle of a potentially really devastating crisis. Many of us care and worry about it. We do small stuff, but the scale of response that we really need to be having is in denial of that fact. And it's totally, it seems to me, I mean, I'm not a great expert, and the little bit of understanding I have is that it's totally achievable for us to make the sort of scale of changes. But there are two things going on. One is that it's not convenient to a lot of people to do that. And the other is that it takes a sort of mass acceptance of this unlikely, and I don't mean unlikely in terms of what we know about the scientific fact, unlikely because it's not like something we've had before, just as putting people into death camps is not like something we've had before. But just because something awful hasn't been experienced before, it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. So it's sort of that area of unfortunate truths. And we saw even a little bit at the beginning of COVID, you know, that we really struggled as a world to go, this is happening. You could see that we have this sort of default towards what we know. We default towards the way our society and life has gone up to that point. And that's also dangerous. So those are the two basic things in my that I think are important.
It's interesting. So much came out of that in my mind. Was that the COVID was demonstrated on the other side, just to your point, that actually the amount of money that was devoted to a crisis that needed solving, if we spent that kind of money in some other way, like on
no question,
on environmental concern, billions and billions, it's doable. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I really agree with you. And I think, again, that's also about what we're exposed to, because we're told certain things about the world. I remember I was always a bit of a fan of Tony Benn. And I remember seeing him talk once, and he was saying, well, you know, in that way of the absolute moral certainty, he'd say, well, they can always find money for a war, can't they? And I was sort of like, that's a simple idea, but actually it is quite a good idea.
It's true.
Because if you think about stuff like the health service, we could get that working if we decided it mattered enough. But the reason we don't is because we're told endlessly by many, many forces that there isn't the money available.
Or for some reason isn't imminent enough. The danger isn't imminent enough.
Right. Yeah, right.
So we think that our current state of life will continue.
Right. Yeah.
You know, we don't really believe that it's going to be disrupted as much as it is. But you go back again to your idea about how we accept things and the lies in particular, for example. We talked at the beginning about the incremental nature of this and the way that we adapt and accommodate creeping change, I think, is part of this. And Halder does it. The whole world did it in the world he was living in. Things that were previously inconceivable become the new normal. So that politicians telling lies is okay, for example. That's a new normal, which is somehow gradually, that's the state of play now. And there's some great stuff in the play itself, some lines I just wanted to pick out, which illustrate the points you've been making about how dangerous and relevant these situations are now. Halder says near the beginning of the play that the anti-Semitism of the Nazis is just balloons they throw up in the air to distract the masses. I can think of a number of balloons that have been floated by our leaders that have been thrown up in the air to incite popular opinion. Take back control, make America great. You mentioned earlier, these slogans that are so simple become so powerful if you tell them enough times, as you just said. And then there's a thing about finding culprits, isn't there, if you're disadvantaged? So the Jews become the culprit. When we are clearly living in a time when you don't have to look far to decide that immigrants or refugees are the problem. And then there's this character in the play, Bach, is a low-level Nazi soldier, and he's bought into this. And he says, Hitler, now, he comes up with this stuff about the Jews. He's thought about it, worked it out. The Jews are sucking the fucking lifeblood of the country. Now, look at us now. He's begun to shake the cunts out. Everybody's got jobs, holidays. And then he goes, you didn't like living in a Jew Germany, did you? Now you walk about the streets and you feel it. You know, this is our place now, don't you? He got us back our own country. Oh, my God. Does that sound like stuff that we might hear today? Possibly without the swearing. Sorry about that.
Possibly without the swearing, although you might hear that in a bar or something. You know, you might hear that place of work. No, definitely.
So what I want to ask you also was whether it's about the moral responsibility of us as individuals, because I guess one of the questions is, how would we have responded if we lived at that time? And you go back to the point about when we've grown up, the generation we've grown up in, Dominic, where we missed the Second World War. And I was fortunate to live in Canada, not America, during the Vietnam War.
Right.
And we've had a whole generation who's not really had to make some of the choices these people had to make. So can we judge Halder?
I think that this is an indirect answer to your question, but I do think that the fact that so many people who lived through the Second World War, even the Holocaust survivors, very few are left. And that has coincided with the rise of forces in the world that are very reminiscent of the things that they struggled against. I mean, we have the internet in the middle of that, which is key, I think, to how misinformation is spreading. But I think it's how do we hang on to the experience, the subjective experience of people who've lived through that terrible time, because I sort of think that whatever we do as a society, we can agree and disagree about, you know, how things are done. But the most important thing is that we are guarded against something like that ever happening again. There's no question. Things like that are happening around the world, but nothing has happened quite on that scale, I don't think. And being aware of the mistakes that were made before is very, very important. So yes, it is asking us as individuals to notice and to do the opposite of what Halder does. There's no question. It's quite a sort of moralistic play in that way. It's got a pretty clear moral line, despite the fact the central character doesn't.
Yes, I guess ultimately it is saying you have to stand up. It's very hard because there's a swell of fervid popular opinion and worse that's going on that he would have to resist as an individual. And there were individuals who tried to. The clergy in Germany went to a museum in Berlin, which was fascinating about some of the people who resisted, but boy, did they get crushed.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously extremely challenging. And that's interesting as well, because in the play, it's Anne, I think, Halder's girlfriend, who suggests that if we just keep our head down, if we just love ourselves, then that's okay. She says it doesn't matter what kind of government that people have, as long as they find somebody to love, have a family and look after them and try not to harm anybody. In the end, you have to survive, and the less you harm people in surviving, and we can hold on to each other, if we're good to each other and the people around us, if we try to the utmost to be good, suggesting, again, this question of who's good and what does being good involve. But there's more to it than that, clearly.
Well, she's an unconscious enabler of him. And I think the point about her is that she's not a stupid person. She's actually quite bright. And she is also full of I think, some very positive attributes of what might be called now self-actualization, in that she's someone who believes in getting on with life and living life and getting what you can out of life. And there's a certain pragmatism in the way she thinks that is quite admirable, but she's apolitical. And there are plenty of people like that. We all know people like that who don't see themselves as political. She says crucially early on in the play, I don't believe in evil. I don't believe in it. So she doesn't see things in that way conceptually. And I think she is therefore the kind of person that can very easily, unwillingly, I think neutrality in the face of these sort of regimes is complicity. When you're dealing with these sort of forces, neutrality is not really an option. I suppose the argument is about the people who tried to stand up to the Nazis once they were in power was they weren't able to get very far. But it's also about being guarded against these forces rising again, earlier than that. And this is where these questions that are very present now around freedom of speech on one hand and the no platform argument. And I am quite torn about that, because I do believe in freedom of speech and I don't believe in cancelling and shutting people down all the time. But at the same time, I also believe that there are certain arguments and perspectives that one should limit people's access to hearing. So incitement to violence, hatred, those sort of things. Open incitement to hatred of minorities. I don't think there's a place for that in public life. So there has to be limits on freedom of speech. And those questions, I think, are really important, because that's how stuff like this gets disseminated. And so I think for us right now, of course, most sensible people believe that it's very important that that we listen to people who don't agree with us, that we allow the circulation of ideas in society that might be challenging. But there's a really big difference, I think, between that and allowing the sort of forces that Goebbels would be proud of to have access to people, because I think they can be incredibly dangerous.
I think what you've said about neutrality not being an option and apolitical not an option is essential. Calling out truth. It sort of reminds us about the nature of the play itself in this dreamlike thing, this sort of detachment from reality, that it's too easy to become detached. In the play somewhere, they talk about neuroticism and the complexity of the nervous system, that somehow there's a disjunct from reality is going on, the definition of neuroticism, I suppose. And at one point, he says, do you think we might be having a nervous breakdown? The whole thing is a national nervous breakdown. It's a great line. Don't you sometimes think like our country and others might be having national nervous breakdowns? But I guess individuals get sucked into it unless you can recognize it.
It's hard. It's hard to face and accept those things because it's painful. If the world is, I had a friend I was working with today who was saying, I've stopped looking at The Guardian. I find it so depressing. She says, I've taken the app off my phone. And I'm like, I really do understand that, because when you look at the news right now, it is so perplexing. It's very hard to come away from it feeling in any way optimistic.
You can't hide. You can't hide, really, can you?
You can't hide. Yeah, no.
I wondered about the ending of the play. I know we don't want to give too much away, but is there a point, do you think, when Halder wakes up?
I think he probably does. He says the line, the band was real. And again, I don't want to spoil things too much for people, but he says it twice at the very end of the play. And I think that's the beginning of him going, look what I'm part of. So, yeah, I think he does begin that at the end of the play.
I think there's a definite reading in it, isn't there, that Taylor says this is real now. What happened before, we were kidding ourselves.
The thing about it is like, how do the death camps happen? Well, they happen because there are enough people who weren't paying attention to what was happening. There were enough people who turned away, chose not to read the signs, got too involved in their own life, didn't believe in politics.
Or got sucked in to the power of the whole thing.
Got sucked in, started believing that the Jews actually were a little bit to blame, and they did do this and they did do that. And all of that accumulates into Auschwitz. That's the end of all those series of denials. So that's why it's important that the last line is the band was real. This is a reality now. And what we've done in production is that the only things that are physically manifest are the consequences of that thinking. So there's book burnings and there's things like that. We decided to make those things three-dimensional and real. Anything else was not really real.
It's incredibly shocking to see that materialized, book burning. Even saying the words you can do, but to see it.
Yeah, it is. It's horrific. And it's not obviously what we do on the stage is nothing. When you look at the scale, there is something profoundly disturbing. And of course, that was happening in 1933. So, I do believe that the Nazis weren't thinking about the death camps in 1933. I think it did accumulate. It was more chaotic. But the murderous intent was certainly there in 1933. There's no question. the sort of feeling of wanting to annihilate and destroy was definitely there. And when you look at that, it's a sort of awful foreshadowing of what happened.
And where that leads, the danger of where that can lead, that's what we have to look out for.
Absolutely.
Dominic, thank you so much. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the future, or something that's just a personal favorite. Now, you've done a lot of the titles that we have covered so far. Maybe there's something you're directing soon or would love to direct. Is there a personal favorite that you could recommend to listeners?
I think one of my personal favorite plays is The Winter's Tale, which I've done actually, because I find it, I think one of the hardest things to write or imagine is redemption and what happens after tragedy. And that play, in the most bizarre way possible. I love the extremity of the play because it's got a 16-year gap in the middle. It's got a bear that comes on stage and eats someone. I mean, it's sort of insane, but it does manage to take an audience out of the worst situation imaginable into something beyond that and into the possibility of hope. And I think it's a very, very beautiful play. But I think one of the things that I love about those later plays is it's someone who'd done everything. And of course, he was an actor as well. So he really understood theatre. And he's sort of going, right, audience, try this. I'm going to bring the bear on. Now I'm going to have someone waking up next to the headless body of their husband. Deal with it. There's incredible virtuosity of that, and the bravery of it is hugely enjoyable. But no, I love that play. And I know a lot of people don't. A lot of people think, oh, it's such a load of old trash. But I really think it's an immensely powerful, beautiful play.
So that's a great choice, because I was about to say there are a lot of people who don't necessarily like that, and that wouldn't necessarily be the number one choice for Shakespeare. So I might have to hold you to it and come back and ask you whether we could do The Winter's Tale.
I'd happily come and talk about that. Most of the Shakespeare plays I've done, I would do again, because I think with Shakespeare, they're bottomless, the plays. There is no correct way of doing them. You sort of begin to realize what the plays are when you finish. And then, of course, I mean, I did that 20 years ago, something like that. When you have a 15, 20-year gap, you're a different person. You bring so much to each of those plays, so you can't stop with those plays.
So I look forward to a cycle of Dominic Cooke Shakespeare plays redone. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dominic. It's been a real pleasure and an honor, as I said at the beginning, to meet you and to talk about this fascinating play. For those who are lucky enough to be listening to this before the 7th of January, 2023, you still have a chance to see Dominic's wonderful production of Good, because it is playing at the Harold Pinter Theatre in London until Saturday, the 7th of January. As the curtain falls on the band playing Schubert, what lesson is to be taken from this personal story of a good man swept up in the frightening power of a popular political crusade? That moral truth is not inviolable. It is vulnerable to creeping qualification and distortion, and only clear-sighted and courageous faith in what is truly good can withstand its corruption. As Anne says to Halder when he falters, you know what good means. Just remember it. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy exclusive access to the Play Review, bonus episodes in which I review current productions that I see in my regular theatre going. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Play Pod and on Instagram at The Play Podcast. Thank you again for listening and for your support. See you next time.